Hey, y'all, this is Mr. Messner coming at you from home base now, getting to our next lecture. This is lecture three of four on the Great Depression. So we're going to be grinding through some more notes. Thanks for your patience and always looking for these lectures and being excited for those of you that are excited about them as they come up. So we already talked about this in our last lecture. FDR got elected. A pretty amazing story, landslide victory, just because he wasn't Hoover. Does that sound familiar? So he got elected because he was supposed to be the candidate that was going to bring about a lot of change, and a lot of people were really excited about that. And so we talk about some of his appeal and just being able to communicate and use communication as a tool in a way it hasn't been used before. He used his messages as fireside chats, made you feel like you're right next to the fire, maybe listening to your grandfather tell you stories, giving you updates on what's going on in the country. Is kind of sort of the feeling that you'd feel as he's talking to you. And then his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and we talked, they're from the same extended family and ended up getting married. And so they're going to have a pretty strange relationship, though. Even when FDR is in the White House, FDR is going to have a nurse that takes care of him, and there's always been sort of controversy about whether he had an affair with that woman. And but Franklin and Eleanor, as they were pretty close when they first got married, started to drift pretty far apart when FDR was president and after he ended up passing away, anyways. So, but how did the Great Depression look in the cities? And we'll talk about in the country too, but in the cities, it had high unemployment, up to 25% unemployment. So that's a quarter of Americans that could work were able bodied, ready to work, just could not find work. That's what we mean by unemployed. So a whole quarter of your population is out of work is tremendously high. It's the highest it's been in American history. That's why we call it the Great Depression. And we haven't been in that similar spot in the modern American history since the 1930s, since 1932. It hasn't been that high. And so, what would people do if they couldn't work? Well, they're not living in places that they could rent or pay mortgages on. Maybe they're living with family members. Where are they going for food? Well, they're going to food lines. We see a lot of ministries crop up and organizations that are out to serve the poor and the homeless by giving them bread and soup as kind of the traditional meal. So at least you're getting something, might be once a day, twice a day, maybe three times a day, depending on how many lines you could get into and find food. And there is a lack of housing just because people can't afford it, right? They can't afford to live in a house that they're paying a mortgage on or rent on if they don't have a job, right? And so where are people living? Well, there's going to be what are set up in every major city, what's called Hoovervilles. And who are they named after? The despised President Hoover, Hooverville. So, and they're just basically glorified slums. And a lot of people like to make comparisons to the homeless issue that we have going on now, but with the homeless living in tents nowadays, it's kind of different than in the 1930s because people are actually setting up more kind of permanent housing that they're living in. Let me show you pictures of Seattle during the Great Depression. So this is the Smith Tower. I know this picture isn't great quality. I'll show you the same one, a little bit better quality. But this is like next to where the stadiums are. The stadiums are over here where the Mariners play. It's not Safeco anymore. T-Mobile Park. And then the Clink isn't the Clink anymore. I can't remember. Lumen Field. Okay, so those parks are over here. This is near the water. This is where the port of Seattle is now. In SoDo, the Starbucks headquarters is over off here to the right. So I'm sure you've probably driven if you've been along Fourth Avenue, that drive. This is Fourth Avenue right here. So it's now a bit different, right? But you've probably driven along what used to be Seattle's Hooverville. So here's the same picture, but it's a bit higher quality. You can see this is just as this Hooverville, Seattle's getting set up. And again, you can see there's some major industry going on here. I don't know what that is, but this is Smith Tower, which used to be the largest building west of the Mississippi in the 1920s anyways, which is kind of a cool thing. But you see people are literally erecting, they're using wood, they're using plywood, using plaster, they're using corrugated sheets to erect kind of semi-permanent housing. And you see there's a stove here providing heat and probably so you can cook off of. So this is fairly permanent housing. It's not like the tents that you see in Seattle nowadays. It's fairly permanent housing. And this is just a vacant field that people just set up shop in. You see this house, it looks like a proper roof, proper sides. So people are living here not just for like a month or two, they're living here for a long time. And it's people not necessarily just that are drug addicts or have other mental issues. It's full on people that have just lost their jobs and have no better place to go. And so you could actually deliver a letter to Hooverville. You just say Hooverville in Seattle, Washington, and the postmaster or the postman, postwoman would walk up and down, and know these people, the residents that live here. And so here's probably what, 1,000 people that are living in the Seattle Hooverville. And most major cities had a Hooverville, either larger or smaller than this, but it wasn't uncommon because that's where people are going, just finding a vacant field and setting up shop. But in the country, we see foreclosures coming down. So as farmers are farming in World War I, times are great because there's this food scarcity. As we get to the 1920s, the price for crops, especially wheat, starts to plummet. And so what do farmers do as the price is plummeting? They start to farm more. They buy more acreage. They buy more machinery to be able to farm more. So they think that their solution to getting out of the problem of going into debt in the 1920s is to go even larger into debt, which as we get to the 1930s, all of a sudden, as people are losing jobs, they're losing their houses, they're not buying food in the same quantities. And so farmers, as the price of wheat continues to drop in the 1930s, cannot pay off their massive debts that they have. So what happens when you have a mortgage that you can't pay? Well, the bank comes in and forecloses on that property. And so debt is going to put farmers out of work. And we're going to see a huge migration of farmers leaving the Midwest area looking for worse work, mainly in California. If you've heard of, what's that book now? Of course, not The Great Gatsby. The one where the farmers are leaving the Midwest to go to California. The Grapes of Wrath. The Grapes of Wrath, that movie, great book by John Steinbeck. I read it. Is about so many thousands of American farmers leaving the Midwest, going to California. Some come to Oregon, some come to Washington, including my grandmother. That was when she came out west and met my grandfather out here. So kind of a cool family story too. Amongst tragedy, but so what ends up happening that leads to this exodus of farmers leaving the Midwest is also what's called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is going to be a series of droughts in the Great Plains, coupled with the farmers that are over farming and over developing and trying to plant more and more crops in the Midwest. What's going to happen is when there's this drought, there's going to be no rain. So anything that was in the ground is basically going to die. And then throughout the Midwest, there's, windstorms. Well, when there's no vegetation to hold down the dirt, it's going to pick up this dirt, and these great big dusters is what they're called, and blow this dirt not just through the Midwest, but into the East Coast. The White House is going to be inundated with dust on occasion. New York City is going to have these big dust storms and clouds come through New York City. There's some incredible pictures of this, and I'll get to some of them here in a second. But these dust storms are going to blow through, burying crops and killing livestock. In some instances, they're going to kill infants that are going to breathe in this dust and can't breathe, or the elderly too that are going to ingest all this dust, and it's going to be sitting in their lungs and they can't get it, and it's going to develop pneumonia and also make some elderly deceased as well. So that's going to add to this flight out of the Midwest and going mainly to the West Coast is where many of these farmers go. And we're going to nickname these people that leave the Midwest and go to the West Coast Okies. They're the Great Plains farmers that head west looking for jobs, looking for farms that they can farm and just work on. So, but they're going to flood the job market and work for next to nothing in agricultural fields. But many of them are going to leave and start lasting legacies there in California, Oregon, and Washington as well. So I wanted to just skip to this other slideshow so you can see some of these pictures of the Dust Bowl, switching over to this. And, I'm just going to go through these quick, but I think just showing these to you will show you the tremendous impact that the Dust Bowl had, the pictures are pretty powerful, even amongst themselves. But this is the area that was mainly affected. This is usually Tornado Alley. This is the height, the peak of where tornadoes form and whip through. But because of the dust that was then carried and whipped up by the lack of vegetation, that was plowed up by farmers, as well as the lack of rain through the drought, is going to pick up, in tornadoes or just even in regular windstorms, and carry this dust around and swirl it in this area, and also carry it to the east as well. So not necessarily us, because of the jet stream, everything goes from west to east. So we were fine. But then what's that going to do? Well, all these farmers are not able to raise crops, raise livestock, or they're losing their farms because of foreclosure, because then now they can't grow things to pay off their debts, to pay off their crops at market. So many of these people are just going to up and leave. And so, like, this orange is like the heavily affected area in the Dust Bowl, and a lot of these people are going to go to Colorado. Some up here, like my grandmother in Nebraska, is going to come and meet my grandfather in Tillamook, Oregon. Others are going to come to Washington. A lot of Eastern Washington farmers trace some ancestor back to the Dust Bowl. But most of them, the majority of these Okie farmers, these Oklahomans or people in the Midwest that are leaving their farms and coming to the West Coast, are going to come to California and enter into LA and this sort of San Fernando Valley, or they're going to go to San Francisco or the Sacramento Valley and be farmers there, just like the book Grapes of Wrath kind of tells their story. So the rains disappeared, not just for a season, but for the years on end. We call that a drought. So here's a gathering storm. It's starting, and then you see it whipping up. It continues to get darker. It's going to darken the skies in cities. It's going to be this big wall of dust coming at you, heading at you. You're kind of running away from it, and it's going to sort of spit up static electricity. So trucks would literally have to drive with chains on the ground. Maybe you've seen buses do that, but chains on the ground, because it's going to be so charged that if lightning can strike these cars or literally short out the electrical systems. So it would be not good to be even running an automobile unless you absolutely had to during these dust storms. Here's another just wall of dust coming at you, right? And so it's like a windstorm, like a dust storm. Maybe you've been in a sandstorm, kind of something like that. So it's not going to kill you. It's going to be a rush of 20, 30 mile an hour dust, kind of sandblasting you. So it's not going to feel good. It's not where you want to be out. So it won't necessarily kill you, except unless you have respiratory issues. So again, just going, this one looks like a tidal wave, right? Just a huge wave coming. This is in South Dakota, so this is farther north. Even the dust storms are reaching up there, called the Black Blizzard. They said it was roughly 2,000 feet high, blowing at 65 miles an hour. So incredibly fast, too. And at some points, more than 200 miles wide. It's an incredibly large dust storm. Just trying to give you some perspective. So 65 miles an hour wind, boom, hitting you, sandblasting your house, knocking paint off. Uh, when the dust fell, it penetrated everything: hair, nose, throat, kitchen, bedroom. Well, a scoop shovel was needed just to clean the house in the morning. And so here again, you're seeing these huge dust storms coming through. Okay, I don't have time to go through all the quotes, but incredibly powerful. Just trying to get through them. So here's sort of the aftermath. You see this guy, years of dust. So one of Roosevelt's programs is what's called the Resettlement Administration, rescuing victims, restoring land to proper use. He's trying to help out, especially those farmers that are out of work uh, through these storms. But it's kind of eerily similar to nowadays, where people are masking up. It was for the dust, not necessarily a virus back in the day, but dust. So it looks a lot similar to nowadays, right? And so here you see, the crops just devastated, right? This is probably a field full of corn. Now there's nothing there. This looks like a sand dune at the beach, right? This plow is there. The cows have nothing to eat, just pretty desolate, barren lands. Again, created by farmers. This is a man made catastrophe that then we learn from. And we start planting trees again. We start planting shrubs. We let grasses grow again. And we just don't develop all the same land that we did in order to prevent this from happening again. And so big trees to try to prevent these windstorms from happening. So We talked about the Okies. Okay, most went to California. And so the legacy in this area is just a tremendous loss of farmers. By 1930, 30% of the population was farmers. By 2007, less than 1% of Americans are farmers. It was a psychological hit for the country to see, what goes up must come down. It's Murphy's Law. Things did come down and came down in a hard way. And then just the migration of Americans westward, too, is going to transform our country. So that was just a little bit on the Dust Bowl and its really tremendous impact that it's going to have during the Great Depression too, and made the Great Depression even that much worse, right? If you think about it, that much worse. You'd be really thinking that the world is close to ending because you don't have a job, you're out of work, and then you're seeing sort of this cataclysmic natural disaster happening in the Midwest, and maybe it's reaching you on the East Coast. Pretty devastating. So, all right, I'll continue from there for a little bit longer. And so, as Roosevelt now comes in as president, he gets elected in 1932. He's going to take over in March 1933. He's going to start in his first 100 days as president. After March 20th, he's inaugurated. He gives his first inaugural address, very famous. We would read it if you're in the classroom with me. He basically says, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." That famous quote comes from that speech. And then the 100 days after that time period is where he tries to get a ton of stuff done to provide relief to the American people who have now been in the Great Depression for 3 years. And so try to do something different, change things up. So you're going to see as Biden takes over as president on the 20th, a lot of people are going to be like, "Oh, what's he going to do in his first 100 days?" Where did they get that from? From Franklin Roosevelt coming in and trying to change things and do what he wants to try to bring relief to the American people. So the first thing he did, if you remember, there's kind of a banking crisis. We kind of talked about it, not really. But banks really ran out of money, went bankrupt, and what happens if banks went bankrupt with your money? Well, then they just closed and you didn't ever get your money back. Well, FDR is going to pass with Congress's help the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. So anytime you put a deposit in your bank up to $250,000, the federal government's going to give you that money back. It's going to guarantee you get your money back if that bank goes bankrupt. And it's the same thing now for credit unions. It's what is it? The NCUA, National Credit Union Association, does the same thing. So if you're at BECU or US Bank or Bank of America, and you those banks and you're depositing money, the federal government is going to make sure you get your money back if that bank collapses. So that happens in the FDIC, which restores people's sort of money and also their faith in the banking system, their faith that they can invest money. And Roosevelt's also going to close banks for 4 days to make sure that the banks have enough money in circulation to not have to close down. So when they open up, they can continue operating as a bank. So also, he's not going to stop there. He's also going to create other what are called New Deal programs. If you remember, again, I don't think I necessarily mentioned it. Haven't had time, but Roosevelt declared himself a New Deal for the American people on Inauguration Day when he said the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. So his New Deal is basically to create all these new programs which would create jobs for Americans. So it's going to put America tremendously in debt, but at the other time, people are going to be working and making money, which is slowly going to be churning the government because that's how the economy makes money is when people have money and spend it, right? Or a consumer capitalistic driven economy. So when people are all seized up and saving their money or they're not making money in a job, then that's not being spent and therefore it's not providing for jobs downstream. So what he did is he said, "Hey, let's do big things like let's build dams." And what was called the Works Progress Administration. Let's, I'm going to pay farmers to not farm for a little bit, which ended up being unconstitutional, but paid farmers not to farm so that prices of wheat went back up. And he's going to do a lot of other programs like Civilian Conservation Corps is going to be like Boy Scouts on steroids, where you go around and you build parks. We had a lot of parks built in our area in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps that would come in and build parks. It's a young boys, and only young boys from age 18 to 24 could join it. And then, 3/4 of their paycheck got sent back to their family at home, and they would keep like a dime, and that would last for a week and be fine. But Some very interesting ideas about basically just the government creating all these jobs kind of out of thin air for people to do to be able to have something to make some money. One of Roosevelt's most popular uh, organizations that he starts is what's called the Social Security Administration, and it's still around, very popular, gets expanded after Roosevelt's days. And so every person above the age, what is it, 60? At 60, you can start a plan for Social Security, although it means your check is very small. 65 is the normal age of retirement. This is when you get your full benefits under Social Security, but you could wait till you're 67 and a half, I believe it is, and that's when you get like an even bigger benefit. So if you can put off retiring, then Social Security will pay you more money to wait a couple years until you start receiving benefits, and you get this until you pass away. So he did this in the 1930s, tremendously popular because people at that time, when they're elderly, would need family to take care of them. But if their family are out of work, so this way, like elderly are guaranteed that they're getting some money to be able to help out. The problem nowadays is that it's going bankrupt. We have so many baby boomers that is driving our deficit way up besides spending normally. But Social Security and Medicare, those two programs, really are bankrupting America, and we're adding trillions of dollars of debt every year now. It just is compounding because there's so many baby boomers. It was such a big generation that they're retiring, needing this retirement money, and then there's not enough workers right now that are working to pay into Social Security. So, is it going to be around for us? That's a great question. We'll see. Just depends if our economy is still alive and well by the time that we are retiring, I guess. So, but based on the popularity of these programs, these New Deal programs that were created, Roosevelt easily got reelected in 1936. He won all states but Vermont and Maine. It's one of the biggest landslide victories in American history. Nixon's going to have a bigger one, in which he wins every state, but was it Minnesota in 1968 or 72. So we'll have to look at that when we get there. But here's Roosevelt's electoral college map. Imagine if you saw this in the election last month. It'd be quite a landslide victory, which it wasn't, but this is what we call landslide victory. So, but it's not all good. Okay. And I think maybe this is where I'll end. I'll come here. So Roosevelt, based on the popularity of his New Deal programs, gets elected twice, and not just twice, but he's going to be elected 4 times. That's where we'll continue next time on our lecture. Thanks for tuning in and taking notes.